Friends, I've got to start with a warning. Today's video is not for the faint-hearted. To my regular viewers and longtime subscribers, I truly appreciate you. And I'm sorry, but today's content is going to be extremely tough. Some details may be deeply disturbing, even physically revolting, not to mention the psychological discomfort that is impossible to erase from memory. Today, I'll be talking about the vile, perverse inner workings of a totalitarian sect that has extended its tentacles into virtually every sector of society in many civilized countries. Members of this sect are not naive followers or ordinary people tricked into joining a movement, as we are often led to imagine. On the contrary, these are well-prepared, often wealthy, and socially active individuals, people from law enforcement, politics, big business, religious institutions, and mass media. They are a tightly knit, purpose-driven organization with a strict hierarchy and a clear strategy. I'll tell you more. Some of them are your priests, deputies, and intelligence officers. The ones who preach sermons, draft legislation, and are supposed to protect you. The ones who have access to nuclear codes and whisper advice into the ears of heads of state. And these people have sunk into not just filth. It is indeed a stinking swamp that is so abhorrent and far from any moral norms that it's hard to call what is happening at least primitively human. What I'm about to reveal involves deeply humiliating initiation rituals that bind these individuals together. It's not my style to dig through dirty laundry, and this video is not about chasing gossip or scandal for hype. Honestly, I myself found the details disgusting, but I couldn't disregard them because in those very details lies something essential. The foundation of this sect's internal hierarchy. Here is their deepest secret, a mechanism of covert control that lets them keep even the most powerful figures in government on a leash. This information is strategically important for anyone trying to oppose the maniacs and sadists who have already destroyed so many lives. But before I delve into the core of today's topic, I want to share some news, something that made this video possible. Those of you who've been following my work know that my team and I have been conducting a thorough, independent investigation into the activities of an extremely dangerous group. This is the same group we'll be discussing today. They present themselves as fighters against sects and cults as anti-cult activists, but in reality, they themselves exhibit all the hallmarks of a hardline totalitarian cult: rigid hierarchy, total control, and absolute submission to their leader. The core of this network is located in Russia and is represented by the organization Ratsiers, as well as the Center for Religious Studies in the name of Higher Martyr Irenaeus of Lyons, headed by the famous sectologist Alexander Dvorkin. He has formed around himself a network of faithful adherents from among anti-cultists, journalists, and other enablers of his agenda, not only in Russia, but also in Ukraine, as well as in my homeland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, France, Germany, and even the United States. Under the leadership of its longtime head, this organized group has been carrying out destructive and extremist activities for over 30 years. Over this time, they've managed not only to deeply infiltrate religious and state institutions in Russia, but also to build a powerful network of influence both inside the country and abroad. This has already led to the rise of a large-scale repressive machine that is crushing human lives across Russia. I've talked about Dvorkin and his organization many times before in my videos. I highly recommend watching the episode titled Dr. Evil, The Greatest Genius. It will give you a full picture of who this man is and what he's really after. That video goes in depth into his psychological profile, the manipulation tactics he uses, and his long-term ambitions. Now, let's get to the news as such. Thanks to our consistent efforts to expose Dvorkin and his sect, we've managed to catch the attention of one of the world's most respected international investigative journalism groups, a team known for a whole range of high-profile exposés that have shifted the course of events in various parts of the world. Their understanding of the scale and seriousness of the threat posed by the anti-cult network led them to join our investigation, which has significantly sped up the process of collecting and analyzing evidence. I'm proud to say we're now working alongside top-tier professionals. Their experience, tools, and resources are allowing us to dig deeper, uncover new links, and verify earlier findings to truly grasp the entire scope of what's going on. Thanks to their involvement, our investigation has reached a whole new level, and we're already seeing results, as recent developments have shown. All of this gives real hope that justice might finally prevail. And most importantly, their presence has encouraged some former members of Dvorkin's cult to start coming forward, slowly opening up and sharing valuable information. They're helping us understand how this system operates from the inside, offering first-hand testimony about what really goes on behind closed doors. For now, we cannot publicly share all their statements or leaked communications for the sake of their safety, since Dvorkin's cult still includes powerful figures not only in Russia, but also in several other countries. However, I've included some key elements from those testimonies in today's video, just enough to make it clear what we're dealing with. In time, you will learn more. What I'll be sharing today will already make a lot of people start thinking at every level of society. But even this isn't the tip of the iceberg. It's just the beginning. I believe in the near future, we will witness a wave of major revelations. At first, they might seem like separate, unrelated events. But in truth, they're all pieces of the same puzzle. And soon, you will see how they connect.
Všechno, o čem budu dále mluvit, je součástí zdokumentované reality, která
Everything I'm about to reveal is part of a documented reality, one that exists alongside our everyday lives, but hidden behind polished office doors, academic lecture halls, political cabinets, and the noble speeches of so-called respected figures. To be honest, I thought nothing could shock me anymore. I thought I'd already seen the darkest depths of this cult. But then, Dvorkin knocked from below again. To fully understand just how deep this goes and to feel the contrast more clearly, let me remind you of who this man actually is. Alexander Dvorkin is a professor of sectology, head of a whole department of missiology. He's the one who coined the term totalitarian destructive sect and defined its main features. He's been portrayed for years as an uncompromising fighter against dangerous sects and cults, someone who supposedly cares about public safety. His name is well known. He is quoted in the media, featured on national TV channels as an expert, praised by the church, and invited by the FSB to lecture. He's a member of government expert councils. He is consulted during the drafting of new laws and included in working groups for their implementation. He lectures to students, passes on his experience and morality to the younger generation. And in the church, where he's an altarman, he goes out in his cassock to congregation and talks about the purity of faith and morality. However, once the cameras are off and the doors are closed, a very different story begins, the one that official sources prefer to ignore, even though the information is already spreading rapidly across social media. Some time ago, video testimonies surfaced online from individuals who claim to have suffered abuse at the hands of Alexander Dvorkin. After watching this footage, it's hard not to fight back a gag reflex. Imagine a man giving a lecture at a university in the morning. His shirt is perfectly pressed, glasses polished to a shine, beard neatly combed, and he has a crisp, starched handkerchief in his pocket. He tells students about the dangers of cults, how sects and cults destroy families, that cult members are a threat to society, potential maniacs, killers, and drug dealers. He talks about his own heroic 30-year fight against those cancerous tumors on the body of society. But once the classroom doors close, he wipes his mouth with that same handkerchief, and suddenly it turns brown.
Dvorkin broke him, and after a couple of months, his parents were released. A friend told me later what it cost him. He told me what Dvorkin made him do. It's been a few years, but even now it's hard to talk about it. He forced him to have sex, forced my friend to eat his shit, and enjoyed eating it himself. According to a friend, this excited the professor the most, and he came while he was eating feces. And if my friend had liquid feces during their sexual games, the professor would swear heavily and accuse his friend of ruining his joy. After these meetings, my friend was constantly vomiting.
Then this same man, after finishing his lecture, changes clothes and hurries off to the church. According to the schedule, it's time for his sermon. Now he's wearing a robe embroidered with golden thread. A sermon, compassion, forgiveness. Everything looks proper and graceful, just as it should. But behind the altar, it's a whole different story.
If someone in the church resisted Dvorkin's perversions, his homosexuality, or even eating feces, they were either expelled or defrocked.
If you've got the stomach for it, I highly recommend watching both testimonies in full. They are publicly available. It's really the only way to fully grasp the reality of what's going on. It's a shock for me to realize that Alexander Dvorkin's sermons are heard in temples. He speaks about morality and faith. Can you imagine such a thing?
Manipulátor, sadista, pedofil
A manipulator, sadist, pedophile, and coprophile stands behind the altar with a cross on his chest and preaches about Jesus Christ, while somewhere nearby in the crowd of parishioners are his silent victims. People who now have to live with psychological traumas for the rest of their lives. Yet, Dvorkin is the man whose name has practically been sainted on Russian Orthodox platforms, hailed as a servant of the church and truth, fighting so-called dangerous cults in the name of preserving pure faith. However, the testimonies of his victims, which have surfaced in the public domain, paint a completely different portrait. And what surrounds Dvorkin, as you know, is not the smell of incense, but a stench from which you can barely contain gagging. You know, after hearing this, there's only one thing that comes to mind. I just want to say to Dvorkin, Alexander, either take off your cassock or stop eating shit. I apologize for my harshness, but it's difficult to restrain my emotions when it comes to such things. You know, given Dvorkin's confirmed psychiatric diagnosis, it's not all that surprising that coprophilia somehow made its way onto that list too. For those who haven't encountered this term, let me explain a little. Coprophilia is a psychosexual disorder where a person experiences sexual arousal or satisfaction from contact with feces, whether it be their appearance, smell, or related actions. Based on the testimonies of his victims, in Dvorkin's case, this deviation took a special form. He achieves sexual satisfaction exclusively in a situation of mutual eating of excrements with his partner. That is, when his partner eats his feces at his request, or he himself eats his partner's feces. Psychologists often link behaviors like this to deep internal conflicts. In many cases, they are rooted in early childhood trauma, broken associative patterns, or severe psychological upheavals during key stages of personality development. It's entirely possible that something traumatic happened to Dvorkin at a young age. What exactly? I won't speculate. But in classical psychoanalysis, there's the idea that such deviations can stem from the earliest phases of development, around 1.5 to 3 years old, when basic mechanisms of control and one's relationship to boundaries and rules are just starting to form. This theory aligns well with observations from modern experts who note that people with these kinds of disorders are usually fixated on two things: an obsessive urge to break social taboos and a pathological need to control others. It's the only way they feel important and powerful. If we take into account Dvorkin's officially diagnosed cyclothymia, a form of bipolar disorder, pathological personality development, and psychophysical infantilism, his path toward this extreme form of control becomes psychologically understandable. An infantile personality with poor boundaries and manic episodes seeks to assert dominance in the most humiliating way to other people. It's a classic case of deep-seated inferiority being overcompensated through extreme domination. All of this could have remained strictly his personal matter or a medical problem of Dvorkin himself. But the real danger is that he forces others, often vulnerable people and even children, into this behavior, using his status, influence, pressure, and fear tactics. What we're really dealing with is a sadist, someone who methodically abuses others and destroys lives without mercy. There's simply no excuse for that. When you look at all Dworkin's public activities through the lens of his psychological traits, known diagnoses, and disturbing tendencies like coprophilia, it becomes painfully clear how his inner pathology seeps into everything he does. Hiding behind rhetoric about protecting society from dangerous sects and cults, he's eventually the one polluting and poisoning everything around him. It's no coincidence that it was exactly Dworkin who coined and actively weaponized the label destructive totalitarian sect to brand anyone who dares to think critically or independently. Dworkin and his followers among anti-cult activists and certain journalists regularly flood the media space with blatantly slanderous and demonizing content aimed at discrediting decent, law-abiding citizens. Their media strategy is designed to humiliate their targets as publicly and viciously as possible. Their playbook always includes the dirtiest and lowest tactics: personal attacks, fabricated sex scandals, and baseless accusations of severe crimes. They deliberately use emotionally loaded labels that bypass critical thinking and stick in people's minds. Things like suicide, drug dealing, rape, and pedophilia. At first, they present those ideas as speculation, possibly, likely, but after just a few articles, by citing one another, they start presenting them as undeniable facts. And of course, no one bothers to trace where the lie actually started. The articles they churn out, sorry, I cannot call it journalism, always follow the same toxic formula. Zero evidence, lots of emotional manipulation, and aggressive, revolting buzzwords like cult, sect, brainwashing, and mind control. Those who have ever read such demonizing publications by anti-cultists know that they all leave the same characteristic disgusting aftertaste, like filth clothed in the form of analytical articles. Facts are twisted, ripped out of context, and when there's no real dirt to dig up, they just invent accusations. Their guru Dworkin points to a new target, launches a fresh wave of slander, and his loyal adherents jump on it, spinning the story with new details that exist only in their imagination. They rely on the fact that most people won't bother to fact-check the endless stream of lies and wild claims they pump out. The whole strategy is designed to destroy reputations and drag decent people through the mud. It's almost poetic, in a sick way. What's inside Dworkin is exactly what he spreads to the outside world. No shame, no conscience, no moral principles. It gets absurd. Fake expert reviews by Dworkin's followers, often citing slanderous articles they themselves wrote, are used as evidence to fabricate criminal cases and extremism charges. And in order to keep it all legit, they lobby new laws, expanding their power and control. Through this campaign, Dworkin and his followers are literally destroying human lives, breaking people mentally, crushing reputations, ending careers, and ruining the destinies of honest citizens. If you think this doesn't concern you, you're gravely mistaken. Most likely, you're already on Dworkin's list of cultists. All it takes is practicing yoga, showing interest in alternative medicine, believing in astrology, or simply holding views that deviate from his rigid religious model. And in his worldview, that makes you a potentially dangerous element who, in his opinion, must be isolated from society. But it doesn't stop there. Dvorkin doesn't limit himself to media influence. He regularly gives lectures to priests, FSB officers, and extremism task forces. He shows up on popular blogs as a so-called expert. And everywhere he goes, he spreads his toxic ideology, teaching others to fear, despise, and hate anyone he personally labels as a dangerous cultist. His lies and poisonous rhetoric seep into every layer of society, like he's on a mission to smear everything he touches with his excrements. In Vologda, he claims that neo-Pentecostals are one of the most terrifying threats to the world. In Chelyabinsk, he calls Mormons a business corporation working for the CIA, that is, dangerous spies who must be eliminated. In Khabarovsk, he teaches how to argue with sectarians, because, according to him, all sects are fakes. At a seminar in Bulgaria, Dvorkin categorically declares children in sects are hostages, objects of exploitation, and targets of sexual abuse. Not a single piece of evidence, no facts, just loud statements inciting panic and hatred. This sounds especially absurd coming from someone who, according to testimony from his victims, is himself a pedophile. In effect, the pedophile is publicly and groundlessly accusing innocent people of crimes he himself is actually guilty of. This is the ultimate form of hypocrisy. However, his destructive activity goes beyond isolated accusations. Everyone who, by his pseudo-expert definition, falls under the label of cultist or sectarian, is declared a subject to elimination, as he compares them to a cancerous tumor on the body of society. The parallels are striking with times when entire groups of people were declared subhuman and parasites, justifying their persecution and physical extermination. What are the consequences of such dehumanizing rhetoric by Dvorkin? His words are like sparks in dry grass, igniting hatred that spills over into bloodshed. Arson attacks on prayer houses, the beating of believers who do not belong to the country's dominant religion, harassment of their children, and murders. These are not random incidents. These are Dvorkin's footprints. Following his lectures and publications, in just a year and a half in Russia alone, there were around 500 documented cases of hatred and religious intolerance. That's only the officially recorded incidents, and only in one country. Every day brings new victims. He doesn't explicitly say, commit violence, harass, and kill. But he does something else. Using manipulation and psychological influence techniques that he has mastered, he implants the image of an enemy into people's minds. He makes you believe that the groups of people he has singled out have no right to exist. Given his analytical abilities, it is inconceivable that he doesn't understand the catastrophic consequences of his own actions. People are subjected to physical violence, lose their jobs and homes, are stripped of basic rights and freedoms, become targets of attacks, face criminal charges, get imprisoned, their children left orphaned. And his response shows nothing but cold indifference. What is this, if not a textbook case of clinical sadism? Dvorkin's actions are not just words. That's genuine informational terrorism. He's a professional sower of hatred, a true extremist. His logic is simple. How do you effectively conceal your own extremism? Start a public fight against it. Likewise with sects and cults. How do you hide the fact that you've created a rigid, totalitarian sect? Start a crusade against sects. It's astonishing that representatives of official institutions and law enforcement agencies, relying on Dworkin's advice and expert opinions when making decisions or handing down verdicts, ignore an obvious fact. Dworkin interprets the entire world through the lens of his mental disorder. Moreover, his diagnosis strictly prohibits him from holding leadership positions. His perception of reality is fundamentally distorted, in part due to a pronounced lack of empathy. And this constitutes an entirely different way of perceiving the world. The most important question is, why do mentally healthy people, those who hold real power, implement his destructive agenda? Before him, the term sect wasn't widely used at all, let alone in such a sharply negative, stigmatizing sense. But today, it is echoed by priests, ordinary citizens, and government officials. It's like his personal footprint, and by it you can easily determine where Dworkin's foot has stepped. He set the agenda. He made it his work and his mission. For 30 years, day after day, without rest, systematically, consistently. Even the president of Russia, who publicly declared support for religious freedom and equality of faith for many years, at some point began to speak using Dworkin's words. And what has this led to? If you're unaware of what's happening in Russia, just look at the news. At the situation with any religious or public organizations that have become Dworkin's targets. Look at what is happening even to other religions besides the country's dominant one. For instance, to Islam and Muslims. Regular raids, deportations, and pressure. In essence, they are being systematically driven out of the country, despite the fact that Islam is a global religion. What then can be said about national minorities whose members are either imprisoned or forced to leave the country? This is the reality brought about by the work of an inquisitor like Dworkin. The case of Jehovah's Witnesses is particularly revealing. Thanks to Dworkin's efforts, they were officially designated as an extremist organization under Russian law. How did this become possible? Because the so-called expert opinions are written by his people. Public opinion is shaped in the media by his followers. The agencies responsible for combating extremism are staffed by his supporters, and among the decision-makers are his disciples. Before Dworkin's campaign to discredit them, Jehovah's Witnesses were known as a law-abiding, peaceful denomination that raised no concerns with law enforcement. However, he employed a well-tested tactic. First, creating an atmosphere of hatred through manipulative speeches about brainwashing and sectarian terrorism. Then, provoking a wave of physical violence against believers. And finally, legalization of repressions through recognition of a group as extremist. As a result of this entire activity by Dworkin, more than 700 members of the religious organization Jehovah's Witnesses have been subjected to criminal prosecution. As of today, 27 individuals over the age of 60 are being held in penal colonies, pre-trial detention centers, or special facilities for those sentenced to forced labor. Many of them are people with disabilities or severe illnesses. It is known that no fewer than 12, and according to some sources 13, have died while being under investigation. Now just ask yourselves, who in their right mind would want to inflict suffering that leads to death? Who would rejoice at the fact that elderly people, sometimes disabled ones, are seized, imprisoned, humiliated, denied medical care, and sent to die behind bars? Someone might say, it must be some kind of mistake. No, it's not a mistake. It's a deliberate choice. It's a method. It's important here to call things by their proper names. People who take pleasure in the suffering of others cannot be champions of morality or defenders of society. They are sadists, maniacs, and sociopaths. This is precisely what Alexander Dworkin is in his essence, and so are those close to him. Because in order to build his empire of sadists, he drew in others just like himself. For example, in Ukraine, his key figure is Irina Krymenovska. I spoke about her in detail in my previous video on this channel. Like Dworkin, she began ostensibly by fighting against cults and sects. But it quickly became clear. It wasn't cults and sects that bothered her. It was about gaining control. And the tools are the same. Articles that label various people as zombified, organizations as totalitarian, and their ideas as dangerous. She doesn't just repeat Dworkin's thesis, she copies them down to the last comma. Ratzier's manuals are like a desk Bible for Krymenovska. Blacklists of sects, stigmatization of organizations, pressure on the courts, all in the best traditions of Dworkin. In addition to the clearly noticeable tendency in Krymenovska's rhetoric to dwell on topics related to excrements, possibly explained by the influence of her coprophilic mentor. There's another fact worth highlighting. Krymenovska started her activist career with dog hunting. According to Ukrainian media, she was involved in killing more than 100 dogs. On one of Dog Hunters' forums, her message has been preserved where she described the cries and moans of dying, poisoned dogs as a symphony. This is a classic case, well known to psychiatrists. Many maniacs start with cruelty to animals before moving on to violence against people. So it was with Krymenovska. Apparently finding the suffering of dogs no longer satisfying, she turned her attention to human beings. Now, she no longer concocts poison for dogs. Her daily work consists of fabricating criminal charges, backing them with fictional expert analysis of her own making, and exerting pressure on Ukraine's law enforcement and judicial systems. Dworkin hasn't merely built his personal cult. He constructed a model, a system in which every adherent becomes his replica. They imitate everything, his intonations, terminology, and tactics, from phrases to actions. And now, those infected by his poison are sitting in other countries, mailing out complaints, writing articles, promoting legislative changes, and turning democracy into dictatorship. In the Czech Republic, one of the followers of Dworkin and Krymenovska is a journalist known for his scandalous and supposedly exposés, pieces about so-called cults. The linguistic and ideological connection to Dworkin's sect is strikingly apparent. In this journalist's articles, rhetorical techniques and phrasing used by Dworkin and his followers are reproduced almost verbatim. She mirrors their approach, dehumanizing the same organizations and spreading his ideology. Following the familiar script, she rapidly attained the status of a cult expert, based on the same manipulative rhetoric. Language of hate has become not just her style, but her editorial policy. At the same time, her obsessive fixation on themes of violence and killing has become increasingly obvious. School shootings have become her personal mania. She returns to this topic again and again, describing the events in meticulous detail. One gets an impression that her discussion of those tragedies verges on fetishes and the deaths of children and the violence inflicted upon them. Like a criminal returning to the scene of the crime to enjoy the suffering of those they once killed, over and over again. In turn, this journalist is connected to another prominent representative of Dworkin's sect in the Czech Republic, a man who has repeatedly referenced Krymenovska in his videos. Who is he? In the best traditions of Dworkin's perversions, his name has spread across the Czech Republic following recent exposés: pedophilia, fraud, drugs, and Satanism. The African children he supposedly helped turned out to be his victims, while Czech citizens were found to be his deceived donors. Watch this video to learn in detail how he abused children under the guise of volunteer work, while Czech citizens provided him with financial support in the hope of helping African kids. Following in his guru's footsteps, he created a website and numerous blogging journalistic platforms where he uses the same rat seers rhetoric, dehumanizes various organizations, and in every possible way seeks their liquidation and persecution of individuals, including physical persecution. According to eyewitnesses, he does it himself, personally. He appears on television as a cult expert, publishes books where pseudoscience and schizophrenia go hand in hand on every page. And, of course, just like Dworkin, he dreams of breaking into legislative system in order to implement his plan of dismantling democracy right here in the Czech Republic. As you can see, in building his sect with the goal of expanding his power far beyond Russia, Dworkin planned everything down to the smallest detail. He understood perfectly well. In order to have real influence, he needed a well-oiled, rapidly growing repressive machine, a coordinated system where every cog works in sync. Some people write, others broadcast, still others execute. Some brainwash the public, while others carry out the orders. Journalists are involved to make it loud, lawyers to make it legal, officials to make it unpunishable. Everything has been planned. Dworkin has been consistently building his own system of influence and pressure. His power has long since exceeded the boundaries of university departments and mass media, reaching an international scale. A clear confirmation of that is his election as vice president of FECRIS, an organization with consultative status at the Council of Europe and special advisory status at the UN Economic and Social Council. This appointment was a key strategic step in expanding the reach of his organization. FECRIS opened the door for him to European and American expert circles and public institutions. He always deliberately sought access to power entities and worked to recruit as many supporters into his sect as possible from among the ruling elite. Because it is precisely the ruling elite that grants his sect's unprecedented power over people. A clear example is Dworkin's disciple, Alexander Konovalov, who, after becoming Russia's Minister of Justice, appointed his mentor as the head of the Expert Council on State Religious Evaluation under the Ministry of Justice. Today, this man serves as a judge of the Constitutional Court of the Russian Federation. What can you expect from justice in a country where a judge of the Constitutional Court is a disciple of such an odious figure? What kind of democracy can we talk about when the leader of a totalitarian sect and his followers become advisors to intelligence and law enforcement agencies? Under such conditions, we can only speak of crapocracy. What has all this resulted in? As we can clearly see today, in real repression. Basically, a man with obvious pathological tendencies has launched a repressive machine in the country, modeled after the worst Soviet practices of 1937. Why do I mention all of these events and connections? So that you understand. I'm not just speaking about a Russian cult leader with psychopathic traits. I'm speaking about how a single cult has transformed into a transnational network, how pseudo-expertise becomes a weapon, how behind the facade of Cossack and pseudoscience lurks not just ignorance, but real, tangible, ideologically driven terror. To help you grasp the scale of the influence of Dworkin's sect, let me put it this way. Today, they have the power to label any group of people, do you hear me? Any chosen group, as a cult or a sect, and it will be considered legal. Then they can demand that this group of law-abiding citizens be prosecuted as extremists, and that will be legal too. And then, early in the morning, law enforcement break into the homes of those innocent people, simply because one copperfile with megalomania decided so. And yes, that too will be legal. I'm telling you this so that you can grasp the true scale and influence of this dangerous cult, one with adherents across the globe, who really weaves this web under the guise of anti-cult activism, using it as a cover to act out of their sadistic urges and pathological obsession, inflicting suffering. Those are morally castrated sadists who have found a legal shield. They say the anti-cult movement is about protecting society, but they conveniently omit one crucial word: human. It's an anti-human cult. A system designed not just to crush human rights and freedoms, but to seize total power. Alexander Dworkin wasn't the first to come up with this kind of approach. He merely upgraded it. He took the old scheme and threw a new cassock over it. And he borrowed this method from those who already proved its effectiveness in practice, from the ideological architects of the Third Reich. More specifically, Dworkin's role model was the Protestant pastor Walter Kunith, who in the 1920s and 30s led the Apologetic Center in Germany. Kunith was the one who started feeding the Reich Ministry of the Interior, the Ministry of Propaganda, and even the Gestapo with slanderous pseudo-expert reports and information about the political views of various religious communities. His organization compiled blacklists: who was dangerous, who had to be spied on, and who had to be eliminated. Dworkin didn't just copy this model. He meticulously implemented the entire scheme of actions, reproducing every point, step by step, from compiling lists of sects and cults to organizing repressions. He's been honing this methodology for 30 years. Today, Dworkin's refined Nazi model is working successfully, from Russia to the United States. Thus, Dworkin and his totalitarian network operate according to the exact copy of the old Nazi methodology. The same principles, the same techniques, and the same outcome. History has seen this before. Do you now realize who Dvorkin actually is and in whose footsteps he is following? Yet, do you know what is most frightening about this whole story? The way Dvorkin has deployed his coprophilic Reich in present-day society. Once again, scrolling through the sheer volume of Alexander Dvorkin's horrific acts and the consequences of his activities, physical, moral, and sexual violence, torture, public humiliation, maniacal obsession with power, and the desire to suppress others, the comparison is quite obvious. In terms of perverted brutality, perhaps only Hitler can match him. And here's a fact that fits in this context surprisingly well. According to a number of sources, Hitler also had a tendency to coprophilia. Further conclusions are up to you. Dvorkin's hierarchical structure, his totalitarian sect with its quest for absolute power, is the result of 30 years of work. Sadism, maniacal tendencies, and coprophilia, perversions beyond human understanding, became the foundation which he built his sect on. Herein lies the key point that I would like to elaborate on. In satisfying his pathological urges, Dvorkin went much further. He based his cult on coprophilia, turning it into the cornerstone of his sect. According to some former members, his perverse gastronomic rituals became a kind of initiation ceremony, a rite of passage into the great mysteries and secret knowledge of the organization. It is believed that once someone goes through this initiation, they gain access to secrets about how to control society, manipulate the lives and fates of others, and essentially, how to gain nearly unlimited power. If we take a step back and look at the situation logically, the existence of such a strange initiation ritual seems like the only reasonable explanation for the extraordinary unity among Dvorkin's followers and their unwavering loyalty to him. That's the root of the matter, as it turns out. Apparently, Dvorkin borrowed the idea of initiation from the mafia. If any of you don't know, in order to become a member of the mafia, one has to commit a murder in front of witnesses. That's how the mafia gets blackmail material and absolute control over an individual. It's just that Dvorkin replaced the blood pact with his own version, a shit pact that made the ritual much more effective. After all, the prospect of going to jail for murder is one thing, but the prospect of your entire community finding out that you knowingly ate feces is quite another. And the prospect of going to jail where they will know you're a coprophile, that's even worse. That is why Dvorkin's sectarians are so fiercely protective of each other. But just think about it. Well, why do the people connected to Dvorkin, politicians, judges, lawyers, law enforcement officers, journalists, and other anti-cult activists, go to such extremes to defend his interests? What drives them to write glowing tributes about him, practically turning his achievements into modern-day hagiographies? Why do his associates suddenly gain support from certain figures in law enforcement or political circles, seemingly out of nowhere? More importantly, this is exactly what explains Dvorkin's apparent invincibility. It becomes clear why he commands such respect among certain government officials and even FSB agents. Why he wins court cases with ease. Why his illegal actions are consistently overlooked. And why, within his own country, he's allowed to operate with total impunity. Now, with a tidal wave of revelations and investigative reports exposing the truth about his activities, you would think that anyone linked to him would be doing everything they could to distance themselves or at least lay low to avoid drawing attention. But what we see is the exact opposite. His followers are actively making videos in support of one another. They're writing articles and comments, going after critics, and aggressively reposting each other's content within their circle, doing everything they can to amplify their narrative and justify his actions to a wider audience. It's paradoxical, but even when Dworkin's followers find themselves under public scrutiny, even when they are directly accused of illegal activity, they keep defending one another and protecting their leader with almost fanatical determination. Why? Why have only a handful of them started speaking the truth, while the rest remain stubbornly reserved? Contrary to logic, contrary to common sense and even personal gain, Dworkin's adherents continue to defend each other and their leader with fervor, as if there were some unbreakable, almost mystical connection between them. The conclusion is that there is a powerful binding factor that makes them act this way. The secret behind this unity, this closed circle of mutual protection, likely lies in what turns out to be a terrifying truth. A shared secret that connects every participant in Dworkin's carefully constructed system. Namely, participation in a very specific and extremely humiliating rite of initiation, the essence of which is reduced to acts related to coprophilia. Simply put, to become a member with Dworkin's hierarchical structure, his adherents eat his feces in front of witnesses. Naturally, after such initiations into great secrets, those people become fanatically devoted to their guru and sect. If you analyze it, everything immediately falls into place. How is that even possible, you may ask? Why would rational people agree to go through such a humiliating initiation ritual? Those former followers of Dworkin's sect, who found the courage to speak out and expose the inner workings of the organization, say that, in the beginning, they were heavily influenced by Dworkin's psychological manipulation. He was a master of turning their perception upside down, making them see white and black, convincing them that what they were doing was right, meaningful, and even noble, that they were serving a higher purpose. They were also told that they would be able to control people's fate from the shadows and remain unpunished. Let me remind you that many of Dworkin's cronies are, to put mildly, characterized by deviant behavior. A mentally healthy and morally stable person would hardly end up in such an organization. For such people with mental deviations, Dworkin's sect became a perfect environment to fulfill their sadistic tendencies without a risk of being punished. We also mustn't underestimate the power of another factor. The intoxicating sense of a total impunity becomes an incredibly strong temptation for people of this kind. That dizzying feeling of alleged godlike control, the ability to decide other people's fates, to influence who ends up behind bars, who gets mobbed by the public, who gets destroyed, becomes an extremely dangerous motive. It is that very illusion of absolute power that the most ruthless maniacs in history have chased after. And it is what drove them to commit unspeakable crimes. Among another factor that pushed future followers of Dworkin to undergo the coprophilic initiation ritual, their own ambitions played a significant role. Pridefulness and belief in their own exceptionalism. They were told that by going through the initiation, they would gain access to hidden knowledge, secret methods of manipulation, and ultimately, real power. As proof, they were shown examples of successful initiated sect members who had allegedly climbed to the very top of the power structure. Names like Konovalov and other high-ranking figures said to operate behind the scenes, even behind the patriarch, and possibly even behind President Putin himself. Those individuals served as living proof of just how high one could rise after being initiated, and what kind of doors would open for those willing to go through the ritual. Within Dvorkin's inner circle of initiated followers, there's a relentless push to get their people into influential positions. And when someone secures a key role, they start pulling others from the sect up with them. This is how a tightly woven network of loyal operatives is formed, gradually infiltrating every level of authority and building a parallel structure of influence that remains invisible to outsiders. It follows classic mafia tactics, step by step. Just like in the mafia, Dvorkin's cult has its own blood ritual. First, through eating their leaders' feces, and then through their joint crimes. Dvorkin's followers are fully aware that what they are doing is illegal. They incite hatred, orchestrate information-based attacks, trample on constitutions, break the law, commit perjury, and even take on paid jobs to eliminate people. I'm not talking about physical elimination, but about systematic destruction of a person's reputation and social standings in exchange for money. Just look at ratseers. They literally have price lists for such services. Moreover, they help not only in Russia, they're active abroad too, removing political or business rivals, or even helping someone win a custody battle by any means necessary. They have no boundaries. But we'll talk more about that another time. Right now, let's stay focused. Now, to be clear, not everyone in Dvorkin's circle of influence or in the anti-cult movement has gone through this initiation ritual. That makes sense. Within his sect, Dvorkin has built quite a rigid hierarchy with several levels of inner circles. He usually recruits new members for his secret club during his countless trips across various countries and cities where he gives lectures. Over the past 3 decades, he has managed to establish a massive, well-organized army of followers. As for the access to his close circle, that's for the chosen few, and far anyone can join it. According to available information, the initiation ritual is reserved only for those who have the ability to form their own groups, influence others, and exercise control over people. Only the most capable and talented manipulators are selected to enter the inner circles. The first circle closest to Dvorkin consists of individuals who are either already in power entities or have prospects to enter those. The second circle is made up of Dvorkin's adherents who form their own micro-cults around themselves and create networks of influence. Those are usually group supervisors or particularly effective lone operatives. These 2 circles, in particular, must undergo initiation through the act of consuming Dvorkin's feces, as it's important for him to be absolutely sure of the loyalty of his close adherents and to have complete control over them. Therefore, he binds them with a terrible secret. The others are simply executors or mercenaries ready to carry out any tasks for money. They pretend to have no connections among themselves, but actually follow the instructions of their supervisors precisely, who, in turn, receive orders from the center. The sect may support them and assist in some ways, but these people are not full-fledged initiates, unlike their leaders. Recognizing such initiates is actually not difficult. They are the most active and zealous followers of Dvorkin. Within the sect, they enjoy special privileges and protection. Some are promoted into politics, others are provided with media support or a high social status. Naturally, such people try to demonstrate maximum activity to earn Dvorkin's special favor and climb higher in the sect's internal hierarchy. Of course, this is very advantageous for Dvorkin. Possessing such powerful, compromising material, he can keep his adherents under tight control. Obviously, for the members of Dvorkin's sect, the status of an initiated member who is privy to great secrets sounds almost proud. Within their circle, there is even a half-joking expression. A couple of minutes of shame and all the doors open for you. But this is a shame for life. A person literally becomes a slave of the sect. Most likely, for many initiates of Dvorkin's sect, this will come as a surprise. But according to reliable information, all the disgusting initiations of each new adherent, I repeat, each one, when you, like obedient sheep, ate the feces of your great guru in the presence of other members of the inner circle, it was all recorded on camera. Yes, you've heard it right. While you were kneeling there, humiliating yourself and losing your human dignity, special people were secretly filming you. Every gulp, every grimace of disgust. Everything was captured. All of this is stored in Dvorkin's personal archive. Did you really think the minutes of shame would remain only in the memories of those who were present? In reality, you signed up for lifelong slavery. Imagine what would happen if one fine day a video surfaced showing a high-ranking politician or intelligence officer eating the feces of some crazy old man. How long would such a person stay in their position? Hours? Or minutes? No authority, no power, no money, or connections would save them. That's not just a career collapse. It's an incineration. After that, no one would even dare to hire such a person as a janitor in a basement. And the higher the position, the louder and more resonant the scandal. Then what? Will you run around shouting that it's a deepfake? That you were filmed by malicious sect members or political rivals? Will that help? Well, perhaps someone will believe you until they see a second, third, or fourth coincidence along the lines of the same ass, the same plate. Even if there is just one such video, maybe an unforeseeable accidental leak. After that, everyone who had any connection to Dvorkin will forever be associated with this shit, both literally and figuratively. Everyone who recorded interviews with him, those who invited him to give lectures at universities, those who pushed him up the career ladder, promoted him to commissions and expert councils, officials who gladly gave him the right to fight sects and cults and write laws, journalists who repeated every word after him, adopting his rhetoric and methods, as well as those who let him into the church and allowed him to run things there. None of them will ever wash themselves clean from that filth. People remember such things very well. Now you understand where lies the secret to the success and power of Dvorkin's empire. At first, all his initiates into deep secrets are driven by some sort of selfish interest. But very quickly, that interest is displaced by an all-consuming horror of exposure. The fear that colleagues, loving parents, children, or spouse may suddenly find out he's not just a sect member, but a coprophile sect member. A person who consciously and voluntarily ate another man's feces. Of course, they fiercely defend their inner circle. This is not even about some vague notion of solidarity. It's about survival. That's why they'll resort to any trickery, any cynical lie, and any crime, just to ensure that no one ever finds out about their initiation, which ties them all to each other and to Dvorkin's ass. This is the kind of secret that binds them more tightly than any blood pact in the mafia. It's hard for me to even imagine how a normal, sane person could undergo such an initiation just to gain power. Is this really the true taste of power? Power gained in such a way? Not honestly, as it should be, by working for people, protecting the country, and then through elections. But, as they say, through the ass. I once called Dvorkin the greatest genius. And horribly enough, I was right. Only now his genius makes me feel nothing but nausea. It is truly genius, but so abominable that only a sick and twisted mind could have devised such an effective mechanism of total control. What more can be said? Dvorkin is the creator of a blueprint for a totalitarian sect. And the scariest part is that it works. Some people may not believe it, and may say that cannot be true, but it works. And you can see it in how all these perverts, maniacs, and sadists from among the initiated, at just the snap of Dvorkin's fingers, obey any of his commands like a well-trained dog's. This takes place at every level, from adopting laws to attacking innocent people in social media comments. According to their plan, this monstrous secret was supposed to be buried together with them. But as the saying goes, you cannot hide it all in a sack. Sooner or later, everything comes to light. Fortunately, thanks to the involvement of experienced investigative journalists who managed to establish contact with some former members of Dvorkin's cult, much is now becoming known, even madness of a kind that no one could have imagined before. I'm sorry, I'm talking now and becoming more and more aware of what's going on. Do you have any idea how many coprophiliacs, or, to put it bluntly, shit-eaters are around us? I cannot even imagine. It makes me want to vomit. People, have you lost your mind? Okay, maybe with a huge stretch, you can at least try to understand those Arab sheiks who everyone's talking about on TikTok. They have probably become so jaded, having tried everything, that nothing excites them anymore. And that's how they ended up with their porta-potty parties. But what about these bare-ass bums? Did they decide to become sheiks too? Just starting from the end? Or maybe from the shit end? I don't even want to imagine what they are doing there. Honestly, I'm at a loss. How can one live in a society knowing that around you walk not just sadists and perverts, but literally shit-eaters? How does one hold back the urge to vomit while watching their smug performances at official events or in the media? How do they calmly shake hands with each other afterwards? How can they look in their own family's eyes? They kiss their children with those mouths. They kiss holy icons. The most monstrous thing is that even clergy got involved in the shameful initiation ritual. In private messages, they ironically called it Dvorkin's anointing and a blessing from our patriarch, by which they meant Dvorkin, a schizophrenic coprophile. What happened to all these people that they managed to create a whole cult of shit-eaters, and in such numbers? Do they really believe that eating someone else's feces will grant them some secret knowledge or power? Or is it their thirst for power, so blinding that it clouds their minds? For 30 years, those anti-cultists have been deceiving people, destroying rights, freedoms, and destinies of individuals. And all these years, no one could stop them. Just because one sectarian shit-eater covered another sectarian shit-eater. What else could you expect from people who have turned their own lives into eating someone else's shit? Just imagine, for 30 years, Dvorkin traveled all over the world, leaving behind a network of devoted shit-eating followers. How many people gathered at his lectures in Poland, in Slovakia? And now the question is, how many of them went through his initiations, the blessing of their patriarch? It's terrifying to even imagine the true scale of this army of shit-eaters. In Russia alone, their numbers have grown so large that they have slipped into every crack. But now it's crystal clear exactly how they achieve that. Now it's already obvious that the real secret behind Dvorkin's career rise was and for what merits he promoted with such zeal. A simple example. As soon as his disciple, who had undergone the initiation, took the position of the Minister of Justice, he immediately gave his guru's beloved ass an honorary seat. How could anyone possibly give power to such a sick man? If that minister had been in his right mind, he wouldn't have let Dvorkin, an illiterate ignoramus with a bunch of medical diagnosis, anywhere near a position of authority. Even if the minister himself was a fool, competent specialists warned him from every side that Dvorkin must not lead the Council on Religious Expertise. Numerous publications and statements were made by scholars and experts in religions, exposing who this man really is. They warned that it would end in repression. And eventually, that's exactly what happened. But it's not enough that this minister, initiated by Dvorkin, ignored all warnings. He went even further. Holding a responsible position, he violated the laws of his own country and, in fact, handed over the levers of power to the sect of his mentor. And since he got away with it, it means someone allowed him to do that. Let's be honest. It is obvious that the one who appointed him minister turned a blind eye to this blatant violation. That means there are still people at the top levels of Russian authorities who have gone through this perverted gastronomic initiation by the guru Dvorkin. Just think about the sect order this man established under the cover of Orthodox Christianity, which includes the cream of society and prominent representatives of Russian authorities. But what about other countries? Take Ukraine, for example. Are there sectarians in Ukraine who have undergone Dvorkin's initiation and now occupy high offices? Judging by what that sectarian woman from the coprophile sect, Kremenovska, is doing and how she gets away with it, we can answer in the affirmative, yes. Let's face the facts, as they say. She's a first-rate crook. She openly publishes materials that make it perfectly clear that she's an agent of Dvorkin's Russian sect, Ratsiers in Ukraine, and therefore of the FSB. And this is happening during the full-scale Russian invasion. After all, it was Dvorkin's totalitarian sect that put a lot of effort into creating the ideological groundwork for Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Kremenovska actively assisted them in that. On her website, she promoted those Russian sectarians of Dvorkin who radically demonized the Ukrainian people and declared that the entire Ukrainian society consists of Satanists. She carried out the orders of those who labeled all of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people as one huge cult, which, according to them, must be destroyed. Moreover, as an unmasked pro-Russian agent, Kremenovska spent years undermining the country from within and eroding the foundations of democracy. She tried to impose in Ukraine exactly the same totalitarian scenario that Dvorkin implemented in Russia. She fabricated her pseudo-expert reports, thoroughly soaked with lies, fakes, and slander, entirely based on her sick imagination. On their basis, she insisted criminal cases be opened against innocent people. Among others, this is exactly what she did to our organization. And what do you think? Criminal cases are actually being opened. People are being raided, arrested, and thrown into jail. In any normal democratic country, no one would even take her report seriously, let alone anything else. Because it all sounds more like schizophrenic nonsense she wrote under fecal intoxication after Dvorkin's initiations. Yet, in Ukraine, there are people in law enforcement, in courts, and the security service, SBU, who get those cases moving. At the same time, Kremenovska publicly admits that, deliberately and like a complete maniac, she pursued law-abiding citizens to put them behind bars, which provided serious grounds for the court to halt the proceedings. Yet the investigation seems blind to this, and the trials continue. That's not all. There is already an open criminal case against Kremenovska in Ukraine, because it's been clear to everyone for a long time that she works for the enemy. But contrary to common sense, cases initiated solely on the basis of her so-called expertise continue to be investigated. And what's more, the pressure only intensifies. Why is this happening? Who benefits from it? Who's playing into the hands of the coprophile sectarians? Read what another prominent coprophile sectarian, Svet Tagore, writes, who's an accomplice and close friend of Kremenovska and with whom they started together as dog hunters. He openly states, "You don't even know who we work for and who's behind us." A very opaque hint that it's either someone from the SBU or the prosecutor's office, or even higher up, who can dictate to both the SBU and the prosecutor's office which cases to pursue and which not. And Kremenovska herself doesn't hide that she acts with some kind of patronage. You know, I've been thinking about this and asking myself, what interest could such a high-ranking officials have in covering up the pro-Russian sectarian Kremenovska? What could she have bribed them with? As we found out, she has no close relatives within the authorities, and it's unlikely that any of them would risk so much or compromise themselves for her. Is she someone's mistress? That's impossible. She's old and ugly, so that option is out. Money? She doesn't have the amounts that could attract anyone at a high level. Thus, there's only one option left. A terrible secret she keeps. Otherwise, who would play into the hands of Russian coprophile sectarians during wartime, thereby aiding the enemy? Only someone who is himself tied by a secret to them and to Dvorkin's ass. This is what power in the hands of coprophiles leads to. They force those who swore to serve and protect their people and country to instead serve Dvorkin and his sect, effectively pushing them toward outright crimes. Imagine what Ukrainians will feel when they learn the entire truth. At a time when there is a war, when defenders are dying on the front lines defending their homeland, when families are losing husbands, brothers, and children, what will people feel knowing that pro-Russian sectarian shit-eaters like Svitogor and Kremenovska calmly roam their homeland? And worst of all, that others like them sit in high offices and issue commands. Just imagine the reaction of those who return from the front crippled, who witness the deaths of their comrades. What kind of pain and rage will awaken in their hearts when they realize that while the entire country was mustering its last strength to repel external aggressions, traitors were sitting in high positions in the country? Those who gained their power by consuming the feces of a schizophrenic, shaggy, bearded monster, Dvorkin, as a sign of absolute loyalty. As Dvorkin himself says, describing his totalitarian sect, power, power, and once again power, then money. This is the slogan they follow. And Dvorkin himself lives by this very principle. For 30 years, he has been building a network, constructing his empire, step by step approaching the pinnacle of power. Now all that remains for him is to replace two key figures in the country, the Patriarch and the President, with his own initiates to fully seize control of Russia. Dvorkin dreams of the role of an architect, similar to Kunith in his time. Kunith, who stood behind Nazism, made Hitler the leader of his sect, but preferred to remain in the shadows of history himself. Dvorkin, however, cannot do the same. His egoism and vanity do not allow him to be content with invisible power. Although he promotes his sect members to top positions, he cannot resist the desire for everyone to recognize him as the true dark genius. Not just a great cardinal, but the real ruler of a country. Psychiatrists believe that the final trigger, when the obsessive idea of omnipotence became firmly rooted in Dvorkin's mind, was his participation in the filming of the movie Tsar. He was captivated by the temptation to become like a ruler akin to Byzantine Basilius, holding both secular and spiritual power in his hands. Dvorkin's psyche, already prone to mania, came under a strong influence of this prospect to obtain absolute sacral authority. Moreover, while working on his thesis, he devoted great attention to criticizing one of the most famous Russian emperors. The in-depth analysis of other people's mistakes gradually transformed into a pathological conviction that he knows better than anyone else how to properly govern an empire. Later on, deep within his diseased mind, a megalomaniac idea began to crystallize, that he's a genius destined to create the perfect symphony of powers, a chosen arbiter of destinies who can command not only the nation, but also human souls. Take a close look at his activities, and you will see how, step by step, Dvorkin is turning his obsessive idea into reality. Examine the inner circle of the Patriarch and the President, and you will find there Dvorkin sect members from his close inner circle of initiates, strategically placed in key positions. It is no coincidence that Dvorkin plays his secret game behind the Patriarch's back, consistently pushing his people into the units of the Russian Orthodox Church. His people from Ratsiers are now present in nearly every diocese, and they do not even hide it. In fact, his totalitarian sect already controls the church hierarchy, and anyone who opposes Dvorkin's plans faces brutal retaliation. Countless priests have been expelled from the ROC simply for dissent and disobedience. Now Dvorkin has set his sights on the head of state. Recently, in media controlled by Dvorkin's sect, a campaign was launched claiming that Putin is preparing a successor. And quite coincidentally, the candidates are initiates of Dvorkin's sect from his secret order. Ask yourselves, why are they stirring up such a wave? Isn't this preparation of public opinion for the transfer of power into their hands? Russians should think about this, and not only Russians. Why does Dvorkin pursue all of this? The other side of his obsession with power is fear of the inevitable consequences of the repressive machinery he himself set in motion. Dvorkin fully understands that his machine of suppression cannot stop for even a minute. If it slows down even a little, the truth will inevitably surface. Facts about innocent victims will be exposed, and people will begin to ask questions. Who started all of that and for what purpose? Dvorkin realizes that in case he will not be able to avoid the fate of Yezhov. Therefore, he had several options, either to drive the country to a nuclear or climate apocalypse, or to take it under the full total control of his sect. The provocation of a nuclear scenario failed. As you all know, his supporters actively spread a wave in the information space to provoke a nuclear strike on Ukraine, which in turn would have triggered a retaliatory response. But in the end, they achieved nothing. Now Dvorkin has only two paths left: to patiently wait for a climate collapse, that is, for the Siberian plume to erupt, or to seize power. As we see, he decided not to rely on just one scenario and to play it safe. Since the plume eruption could still take years, he preferred not to waste time and to act right away. To achieve his goal while remaining unpunished, he has no choice but to keep turning the wheel of repression. Replace two key figures in the country, impose his ideology as the state religion, and thus completely subjugate Russia under himself. Imagine a coprophile, pedophile, and sadist with manic tendencies at the head of a country possessing the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. What will this lead to, especially considering that his manic ambitions do not stop at Russia, and his sectarians are already actively operating in many countries across the world? That is precisely why Dvorkin's totalitarian sect, operating under the guise of the so-called anti-cult activities, must be recognized for what it truly is: an extremist organization. All anti-cult activities need to be officially banned by law worldwide before it's too late. Of course, unless it's already too late. Is such a ban realistically achievable? The question remains open. After all, Dvorkin's sectarians have already occupied high positions within government authorities in various countries and will undoubtedly fiercely resist any attempts to restrict their activities. Even with overwhelming evidence of the crimes committed by his anti-cult sect, when adoption of prohibitive law becomes an obvious and necessary step, the initiated followers of Dvorkin will do everything possible to oppose it, regardless of the risk of exposing themselves. However, if Dvorkin's sect is not banned, what consequences can that lead to? Let me repeat, the world's largest nuclear power in the hands of a maniac. This is something worth seriously thinking about.